Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this webinar on MasterClass CSU, which my colleague and friend Ed Martinez and I are presenting on success and failure in projects. I'm very glad you're able to join us today. This webinar is for people of all backgrounds and levels of experience that are focused on and perhaps responsible for the outcome of a project. You could be a commissioning manager with experience gained over many projects, or a graduate engineer working on your first project. Or you could come from senior management at VP level, vice president level, where you have some control over the purse strings and are most definitely interested in the outcome of the project. Whatever your background, this webinar is for you. It will be recorded and later published on YouTube and available to individuals and companies that are registered to attend this webinar. Commissioning and Startup, which is commonly known as CSU, is full of jargon and acronyms. And if we use a term that's unfamiliar with you and it is not adequately explained in the webinar, please do contact us through the chat box, and you have my apologies for doing so in advance if we don't explain something. To maintain the webinar's flow, we will take questions at the end after about 45 minutes, that would be. And please post your questions in the chat box and we will address them in the order received. So we'll just quickly run through our respective bios. Ed, if you might to start.
Yes, everyone, I'd like to introduce Alan Mills. Alan is a CSU course director for Petro Skills. He's also the author of MasterClass CSU series of industry-approved training courses for engineers, technicians, managers, and executives in commissioning and startup and systems completion. Alan is highly experienced as a CSU advisor and auditor. He has over 30 years experience contributing to the successful delivery of projects ranging from offshore LNG and process facilities, I'm sorry, that should be onshore LNG and process facilities, to FPSOs and offshore deepwater developments. Alan is an engineer and a businessman. He created Falcon Global Limited, a UK company, in 2000. And then in 2010, he spearheaded the launch of Zenator, an automation software product used by customers that include Chevron, ExxonMobil, Kiewit, Petrofac, and Shell.
Thank you, Ed. Now for Ed's background, Ed Martinez has held numerous execution leadership positions in world-class project teams from the owner's perspective with ExxonMobil in the USA, Malaysia, Russia, Indonesia, Canada, and Alaska, as well as from the contractor's perspective while based in Houston, Texas, and Aberdeen, Scotland. And that was for clients such as BP, Total, Eni, BHP, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. Ed has also been a vice president in two multi-billion-dollar per year engineering and construction firms where responsibilities included company or unit-wide management. Ed's unique experience mix from both the owners and contractors' perspectives allows insights to the most effective execution strategies to achieve project objectives.
Thank you, Alan. I'd like to get the ball rolling by asking you a few questions. First off, in the video advertisement, you talked about several things that are common to every project. You mentioned success and failure and critical success factors common to every project. You talked about building resilience and fixating on failure. Then you said success is dependent on triple E. Can you break all of that down for the audience, please?
Yeah, sure. There is a lot to take in here. First off, it is not a given that every project will go on to become a financial success when viewed from an investor's or end user's perspective. as CSU professionals, we must work hard to make that happen, to ensure the project will go on to become a success. And the best way to do that is to have the right people involved from the earliest stages for what we call effective early engagement, or triple E.
So Alan, who would provide triple E and what would be some examples of it?
Right. Okay, I'm going to bring up a slide to discuss that as I explain. From around the start of FEED, front-end engineering design, if not sooner, the owner-operator needs to bring in a qualified, experienced CSU professional, someone that we would have called well-seasoned. And having the right person involved at those early stages is so important, because he or she will consider what we call the commissionability of the project, and their findings can then factor into the design.
So Alan, do you have any real life examples of that?
Yeah, sure. One of our Zenator customers, a large EPC, told me recently about an oil and gas production project that they were awarded to build in North Africa, in the desert. They weren't involved in FEED, so their first involvement, and I'll show it on the graph here, was around the execution phase. That's in what we call phase 4. In the execution phase, that's when they really got involved, and you can see that they're already kind of low down on the influence curve here. So anyway, what they noticed was that in their commissionability review was that there wasn't a bypass for gas compression, so all gas production was flowing through the compression facilities. However, the reports showed that the reservoir pressure was good and that gas compression wouldn't actually be required until about 3 years into after the plant had started up and gone into production. So they proposed a bypass. The engineering changes were made, new HAZOP performed, drawings issued, and there was no actual impact on construction, which would have been massively expensive. So the end user, the operator, was extremely pleased. They'd seen a significant reduction, shortening in the project schedule. They'd seen unexpected early income from that project, as well as they were able to produce oil earlier than perhaps they'd expected. However, the key takeaway was that no one had considered commissioning during FEED or until the main contractor, the EPC, was involved. And so the opportunity was actually revealed, disclosed about a year after it possibly could have been identified.
Yes, Alan, I have a similar example from my experience where effective early engagement saved an international offshore project millions of dollars in weeks of time. In this case, the original commissioning plan was to utilize diesel fuel generators to power everything in the entire offshore complex for the entire commissioning cycle. My team noticed an opportunity and accelerated the commissioning of the power generation, the power distribution, the well test, and the fuel gas systems of this 3-platform complex offshore. We then worked with drilling and operations to drill and complete a gas injection well first and install a bypass to allow backflow of gas from that well to the well test and the fuel systems. This allowed the entire complex to be powered by its own power generation system and fuel produced by natural gas very early in the commissioning program. Engagement from CSU is only truly effective if it's early enough in the project timeline. What we talk about is acting at that high point of the curve on that influence curve where Alan's showing you now. There are many projects I know of that had CSU people involved from early on, but they were ineffective in benefiting the outcome of the project. Alan, what about critical success factors?
Yes, sure. I'll come on and show that in another slide, Ed. In 2015, the Construction Industry Institute, which is based here in Austin, Texas, published a report based on a members' survey and found that there were 16 factors that were critical to a project's success. In order of importance, the first four of these, the top four critical success factors, are alignment. And that means alignment with the owner's team, the project management team, with construction, with operations, with CSU, and with engineering. That key alignment of being all one team. Secondly, CSU methodology. So that's the tools, the workflows, the procedures, the check sheets, if you like, the actual software, the database that's used and central to so many projects today. And in today's regime, of course, all of the mobile technology that we would use and harnessing the technology to help the CSU process. So the second most critical factor, CSU methodology. Thirdly, we have the CSU team capability. So that means having skilled, qualified, and experienced people and available people in that team, needed, the right people when they're needed to be present as part of the CSU team. And then fourthly, an integrated construction and CSU schedule. So that, I think that is an obvious point, self-explanatory point. Now we do go into all of the CSFs, all of the critical success factors in some detail in the MasterClass CSU training courses. And we go into a lot more besides, but we do expand on these and why they're so important and how to apply them.
You know, Alan, I completely agree, especially on the alignment point. You know, I imagine that some of the projects we mentioned earlier where CSU people were involved early but were not highly effective may boil down to a lack of alignment among the key stakeholders. You know, large projects require large project organizations. It's just a fact of life. And in large organizations, it's sometimes all too easy for the various departments to go to their respective corners or remain in their comfort zones and not really interact with the other departments in the project team. However, a common denominator I typically see in successful project organizations is when all departments come together as one team that agrees on and commits to a common set of goals and objectives. I've said many times that projects, operations, CSU, engineering, and construction are all in the same boat on a project. And they're all either going to get to the other side together or they're all going to get wet. It's simply impossible for any one of those groups to be successful in a project unless they are all successful. And the earlier the project team realizes and aligns on that, the more successful the project will be.
Yeah.
So, Alan, what did you mean when you said fixate on failure? How does that contribute to success?
Yes. Success is not a given. Just because a facility, and I can show this in another example, just because a facility has been sanctioned to receive funding and has been designed by engineers, it doesn't mean necessarily that it will go on to become an economic success. The world is littered with projects that did not work or work as intended. To be successful takes knowledge, effort, and dedication. Now, I gained most of my 30 or so years experience in the oil and gas sector where to be successful, you absolutely have to focus on CSU from the earliest possible stages, with the attitude firmly to begin with the end in mind. Becoming unified with a common set of objectives will bring that alignment you talked about, Ed, the one team approach. In terms of the technical process, figuring out from the owner's perspectives and transplanting these into an initial startup sequence for the project is known as systemization. Now, some people think that systemization means merely a colored set of P&ID drawings marked up by the CSU manager, showing how the systems are divided into subsystems, and these are then prioritized to give the initial startup sequence. And that is true to an extent. You know, those do demark the boundary conditions, the battery limits, or limits of system handover, whichever term you care to use. But what most people don't really fully understand is that systemization should be considered as a signed in blood agreement between construction, CSU, and operations. It absolutely defines how construction will transition from an areas approach bias to a mechanical completion bias, and then transitioning for the highest priority systems and subsystems, and how they'll be handed over to CSU for pre-commissioning, followed by dynamic commissioning, until ready to be transferred to the final end user of operations.
Right. What people might forget or not be fully aware of is that CSU is always going to be on that critical path.
Yes, exactly. And that critical path is likely to change during the life of the project. Design changes, operational conditions, logistics, equipment availability or failure, any number of things can happen depending on what type of project is being completed and where it is located.
Yes, and the projects start following the systemization plan, that will necessarily mean that they're going to have simultaneous operations, right?
It will, yes, because the highest priority subsystems will go through the process of mechanical completion, pre-commissioning, and dynamic commissioning before startup and handover to operations. And projects will need to get their permit to work regime up and running, for example. And that means there will be SIMOPs, simultaneous operations, as the highest priority subsystems are energized and brought online. Just coming back to systemization, on any project, systemization is unlikely to be a one-time exercise. In remote or difficult locations, resystemization might take place several times. The best way for a project to cope is to be prepared and to consider several scenarios for completion.
So is that what you meant when you talked about building resilience?
Yes, exactly, Ed. When fate deals you a bad hand, you can recover much more easily with no serious outcome. By building a high-performance CSU and project team, you have ready-made recipients that will be eager to use relevant lessons learned from previous or similar projects. They are going to be more willing to write their experiences into best practices.
So it's like Arnold Palmer, that world famous golfer of the 20th century, said, the more I practice, the luckier I get.
Exactly, Ed, exactly. And the more you think about and plan for what can go wrong and deal with the scenarios accordingly to mitigate risks, the better prepared you will be and more likely to succeed every time.
Yeah, Alan, you know, the motto of the United States Marine Corps is Semper Fidelis, which is Latin for always faithful. The motto I like to adopt in my CSU teams is Semper Gumby, which we say means always flexible. CSU teams must accept the challenge that they'll always be on the critical path, and therefore, for the projects to be successful, CSU must always be looking for ways to gain progress and flexible enough to adjust their plans to find workarounds and alternative pathways to achieve the end goal when things in other departments don't go as they had planned.
Exactly, exactly. But, you know, what we haven't talked about so far, and it's the real elephant in the room, is the investor or the final end user. And I know this because my role at one time earlier in my career was project evaluation. Then operations just assume, the end user will just assume that if the net present value for a project is sufficiently positive, then that project is going to go on to become a financial success. But it simply is not the case. It isn't a given to achieve, and to achieve success, it must be pursued diligently by the CSU manager and his or her team. So I can now come and talk about this graph that's on the slide on the screen that you can see. Now, this is an idealized project. It shows a year-on-year production with a gradual cumulative S-curve of production, and it shows reaching a peak and then plateau, and then a gradual decline. So that's a pretty typical project scenario for an oil and gas production project. By sanctioning the project, the owner then has already assumed that that project will be completed within budget and schedule. And of course, that it will be fully commissioned before being started up. But too many times, projects are finished while CSU is incomplete. And that means investors are just left licking their wounds. Incomplete CSU means production bottlenecks, where complete processes or large parts of the facility are not operational or operating at anything close to capacity. Have you seen any examples of that, Ed? Because I know I have.
Yeah, sure, Alan. I've seen this all too many times. You know, one recent multi-billion-dollar project with which I am somewhat familiar got behind schedule and got over budget, and immense pressure was put on the project team to finish the project and hand it over to operations, which they did. Sadly, the operations team quickly learned that the facility wasn't even capable of actually performing as intended. So soon after, you know, the owner initiated an quote unquote expansion project to increase capacity. However, the majority of the scope of the expansion project was to debottleneck and otherwise fix things that didn't actually work properly in the initial phase of the project.
Yes, I had a similar experience early in my career, and that was when I worked for a major North Sea operator and switched from working in projects to working for operations. The short version of this story is that after the project had finished, and I thought the project team had done such a great job at CSU, and myself included, I transferred to ops and then spent the next 18 months or so fixing leaks and debottlenecking those same offshore gas platforms in the southern sector of the North Sea. I ate a massive helping of humble pie, and it has forever made me focus on the needs of the final end user.
Yeah, Alan, I can't reiterate it enough. I mean, you know, my first 7 years of my career were spent in operations for a major international oil company. Project folks often have schedules that are in terms of days and weeks and months, but operations folks often think in timelines of years and decades that they're going to have to operate whatever facility we're building for them. And issues that may be a minor annoyance and can be easily tolerated for a few weeks in the project phase can easily turn into huge pains in the backside if they must be dealt with for years. a successful project team never loses sight of the fact that they're actually only doing the project so that the owner can have something to operate.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, Alan, you talked about the costs of failure. Let's take a look at what those are over and above the pure monetary costs.
Yes, the cost of failure. So the greatest cost, of course, is the unintended loss of human life and all accidents. Whenever this happens, there is very often also a loss of containment. So something that should have gone right has gone wrong. And when this happens, it is obviously unintended, but it is also avoidable.
So what does MasterClass CSU have to say about process safety?
In CSU, we take process safety very seriously, of course. Energizing and starting up a facility is not a trivial matter. Millions of dollars of equipment are at stake, and the CSU manager is responsible for the safety of the team working under his or her direction. Projects need to have robust processes in place, like lockout, tagout. They must diligently record all inhibits and isolations. They must keep good records of all temporaries in place and align very closely with the permit to work process. Projects can then mitigate risks and smoothly progress to safe and timely completion.
So what else can you say about the costs of failure?
Yeah, I'll just go through the remainder of this slide, which are showing those avoidable costs of failure, and come on to the next, which is a similar sort of graph, but you can see that this project, and this is from a real project that was shared to me by an operator here in Houston. It's been sanitized for public consumption, but it is from a real Gulf of Mexico project. And just look at what happened. The planned production was somewhat similar to that last graph I showed, like this, but the real actual production was much, much less. And this was because the project had introduced numerous arbitrary milestones, which were meant to incentivize early completion, but because they had not done any mechanical completion, any MC, or pre-commissioning at the fab yard, which was intended, a great deal more scope was taken offshore for final completion, for full hookup commissioning and then startup of the facilities. They did meet deadlines. You can see that from the timings on when the project went into production, but they had to cut a lot of corners in order to meet their deadlines, and that meant that the bottlenecks were created, production bottlenecks. And every time a production bottleneck is created, you're taking a chunk of production away, an amount of income that the investor had expected to receive. The inevitable happened. The project never was able to go, the company was never able to go back and spend the money to fully debottleneck the facility. And they told me in their own words that this project was a disaster. It had only ever operated at best at about 2/3 of its capacity. Now, when a project has failed, there will be a trail of evidence, like a bit like a smoking gun. Most apparent, and it's something we can all detect as humans, is that when we arrive at that project for the first time, we go through the entrance gate, or you come down off the helideck if you're offshore. You can actually sense it. You can almost nearly smell it, that there's something bad going on here. The natural energy and the mood of the people is bad. It isn't good, and you'll find the morale is also not good, and sometimes it's really bad. So take a glance at that project's safety statistics, and if they're being reported honestly, you'll notice that there will be a high number of accidents and incidents. There could possibly have been some fatalities. There could well have been some losses of containment. So there'll be a chain of events that take place. All of those things are entirely avoidable. And when that happens on a project, that will result in an investment failure for the owner and the investors, and it brings reputational risk to the companies involved. The well-worn mantra that all publicity is good publicity definitely does not hold true when it comes to reputational risk. Just think about BP Macondo, Deepwater Horizon, or BP Texas City, or the Exxon Valdez. Now, if those events are not familiar to you, you don't know anything about those major events, we do cover them all and other case studies in MasterClass CSU training.
So is it simple enough to say that the price of success brings a virtual spiral of benefits?
Well, yes, absolutely it does, Ed. It is completely true, because I have seen projects that started as they meant to go on, or have taken steps to transform and then have laser focus to begin with the end in mind. So I've just come on to showing here what the price of success looks like on this slide. You know, the results, Ed, they're the exact opposite of the failed project. And again, you can tell when you're involved in a successful project, or you visit a successful project. You notice it the moment you go through the gate or come down off the helideck. There is a good energy about that project, and it is palpable. There will be a real team spirit with high morale, and virtually no absenteeism. You can tell you're in the company of a high performance team, and when people feel better about themselves and their project, they're going to be more vigilant, and that translates into process safety being to a much higher standard, perhaps excellent. Occupational safety will also be really good, perhaps excellent. There are a lot less incidents or near misses. Better all-round team spirit in an atmosphere where morale is high means that people put more into their work. It is true. I've seen this with my own eyes. There is a much higher chance that that project will go on to be fully commissioned before it is started up, which means the project has a much greater chance of being a financial success for the final end user and for the investors. And I can just finish off this slide and show what I've been talking about. Those prices of success are much, much lower than the costs of failure. Now, if I come on to also show a slide on the what a successful project looks like from the perspective of an investor and final end user. Now, this project is actually from the same operator that shared with me the details of the disastrous project. Here, the project team worked as a unified team, the one team approach that Ed talked about. And they were not blown off course by having arbitrary milestones imposed on them. Instead, they focused on getting the facility fully commissioned and then handed over to operations. The operator, the company, shared these with me as stark examples of what success and failure looks like from the perspective of the final end user and the investor.
Good. So that brings us pretty much to the end of the discussion. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat box, and we'll take those now in the order that they were received. Okay, so we have a first question up. It says, good afternoon. So this must be someone in a different time zone. Which CII CSU course would you recommend?
CII, Construction Industry Institute.
Yes.
I'm not able to recommend any CII courses. I don't know them well enough, but I could certainly recommend one of our MasterClass CSU classes or courses for anyone that wants to know more about what we do and what and to be able to prepare people for to be a better team player and to become qualified in CSU and systems completion.
Okay, same person asking to please send the link to the course, and we will show some links to some courses here at the end. Do you provide any courses online? Is the next question.
Yes, we do. We do all modalities. We have a return to in-person course classes starting in February. The details will be coming up on the next slides after we've finished. But we have e-learning courses, which we've been doing for since the beginning of 2019, one full year before the pandemic. And we also do virtual classroom training as well. So the three modalities, and those are at foundation level, and also we have a manager level course, which is going through approvals at the moment with one of the bodies, the industry bodies.
Okay, we have a next question. What would be your recommendations for convincing the project management for the early commissioning involvement?
Well, as we said right at the start, and I'll go back to the slide here, is to bring in CSU professionals early on, maybe in phase 2 of the project in here. So you're really high on the influence curve, and you can think about that commissionability. And you can think about how what that looks like. What do I mean when I say that? Well, you could be thinking about a modularized approach. Many companies would automatically go to a modularized project and contract strategy these days. But a few years ago, that wasn't the case. And a lot of people conventionally thought, well, we're going to stick build this project. But having a modularized approach means that you will be able to carry out a lot more CSU activities, completion activities under the most favorable conditions at the fab yard or at the shipyard. So I definitely recommend getting people involved in here when you can. Older heads, more seasoned and experienced people can then factor in that experience into the decisions that will influence the project. For example, modularization.
Yes, modularization or installing key bypasses,
Yeah.
or key, feedback loops in the instrument control systems. Those kinds of things are easy to put in early in the design concept, but when you're out in construction, it gets difficult. So that's the justification to bring CSU in early. Back to the courses where the same person asked if we provided an online course. They're asking about, is it an intensive course? And they put 2 or 3 weeks.
The in-person course is a 3-day class or course, and it is pretty intensive. When we do the virtual classroom training, we run that over 2 weeks. So it's like a 3 to 3.5 hour day for the first week and a 3 to 3.5 hour day for the second week. So that's how the virtual classroom course is set out and structured. For the e-learning classes, which which are very popular for people who work on rotations, and people who need to demand flexibility in the way that they can take the course, they'll typically take quite a lot longer. So I ask the individual to make a study plan, which they'll agree with their line manager and with me, so I know the expectation of how long. And so the e-learning course, which is the same content, typically can take several weeks, maybe take 2 months perhaps.
So we had another question here about the timing of engaging CSU. So how early the CSU team needs to be in the project during PDP, feed phase, or EPC?
Well, it's a similar answer to the previous question, Ed. If the CSU team are only getting involved at the EPC stage when the contract's been awarded, which is going to be after final investment decision, and right around the start of phase 4, execute, then you can see, just as you said, Ed, you're already pretty low down on that influence curve, and that means you will have much less ability to be able to influence things. You can get things done, but look at what happens to the costs of getting those things done. Those costs, they go up exponentially. So right. Just as influence declines, costs go up. So that's why we talk about getting involved early.
Yeah, and I would reiterate, it may not require, early in the PDP or feed stage, may not require a full-blown commissioning team. You're talking about the commissioning manager and maybe 1 or 2 discipline leads to really have the influence early on. And then you can ramp the team up as the project progresses. Okay, our next question: how may both construction and commissioning work together to ensure CSF on any given project?
Well, the short answer to that is they absolutely have to work together, don't they? Frankly speaking, construction folks have the most to learn, and projects as a whole have the most to gain from getting construction people that work in construction more well educated in the CSU processes, or at least their role in contributing to them, which is what I talked about in systemization. Because in systemization, it means there's absolutely means there will be a transition from an areas approach on the project to one of progressing the highest priority subsystems to enable initial project startup.
Okay. What would you suggest if design issues are just encountered during CSU stage, things not performing as expected? Since lots of things need to be sacrificed when we try to rectify not only cost, but also schedule.
Yeah, that can happen. It can very often happen when processes are new or perhaps not fully proven, a new item of it, perhaps a novelty item of equipment. So there are things things don't always work out as they were planned or designed, and really that, although that can be expensive, it isn't necessarily terminal, because that's really what the CSU phase is for. It's to fault find and fix the project, and to be able to get it up and running and put it into operation. So it's the CSU phase done properly that will discover any anomalies or anything that's not working as it's designed and intended.
Yeah, and I think you come back to that one team concept. You know, CSU is the first guys that are energizing systems, pressurizing systems, putting power and signal and everything to all the components, and often are the ones that find problems that, hey guys, this isn't working like we thought it would. But if you have that one team approach well in hand, and engineering and construction as well as operations can all, you know, come together in a kind of war room or disaster mitigation mode to problem solve, you know, oftentimes you can find workarounds and keep the project pretty much on schedule and hopefully on budget. You know, obviously if the thing goes long, it's going to cost more. So
Yeah.
it's really about identifying where those problems are and having that one team approach and getting engineering and sometimes it's the vendors, everybody involved, the critical stakeholders together to actually, you know, figure out a workaround of how we're gonna save this thing.
Yes, and also another example would be of effective CSU involvement early on would be in things like string testing, for example, of power management systems or of rotating equipment, for example. So that would be that's the perfect opportunity to discover if there are any anomalies or um, design flaws in the specification of rotating equipment, for example, so that it can all be discovered when you're at the manufacturer's facilities, and therefore it will have much less. It's going to have an impact, but the actual impact will be considerably less than it would otherwise be if it's taken out to the final location and then discovered.
Okay, good. So next comment, early engagement with the taking over team and operation phase is also essential. Will the same principle as CSU apply, or would you have a different prescription?
Sorry, could you repeat the start of it, Ed? I didn't quite catch that.
Early engagement with the taking over team and operation phase is also essential.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're talking about the handover from project and CSU to operations, and saying early engagement with those operations team is also essential.
It
And
is.
he's asking, will the same principle as CSU apply, or would you have a different prescription?
I would. I recommend that a similar process actually, because what will happen in a successful CSU team and a successful project is there will be a considerable number of the people that make up that CSU team will come from operations. So they will provide a considerable. They should be able to provide a considerable amount of the expertise that will come into the CSU team to provide so that they can become familiar with the plant and learn how to operate it without necessarily breaking it. They will be able to use their operations and maintenance experience to be able to do things like run preservations programs. And they will become fully trained and skilled so they can transition seamlessly into the operational phase when the plant is handed over. It's not going to be like a complete baton change in a relay race, because the operators will have been part of the CSU team for possibly a couple or more years before the plant is handed over, and so they'll be experienced and familiar, that's a vital that's really vital to any successful project.
Agreed. Next comment is just a thank you. It says, thanks for sharing experience and guidance, and I would like to attend upcoming webinars also. Excuse me.
Well, thank you, everybody. That's great. I hope so too. We may well have other webinars that will follow on from this on slightly other key topics. Yeah, I think we've got probably time for a few more questions, have we, Ed? If there are any others?
Yeah, I believe we do have some more questions. The next question, do you think the value message for CSU involvement in the early phases of a project is understood by clients and PMS teams in industry? These costs are an easy target for cost cutting at the tender phase.
Yeah, I definitely do think that there is that those people, those stakeholders that the questioner asked about, they do need to know more about what's about CSU and its importance. That really is the key thrust of this webinar today, to talk about those what success and failure looks like, and that it isn't a given. And the way to generate and ensure success is to have the right people. Is one of the ways is to have the right people involved from the get-go. It won't, otherwise it's you're in the lap of the gods. If you don't have, the projects don't have the CSU expertise involved from those early stages, and allow them to be influential, so that their experience can really be beneficial to the outcome of the project, then those projects are really going to suffer, and they can be just like that disaster project I showed on one of the slides there. So yes, they've got work and things to learn. We do have a MasterClass CSU leadership course. It's a one-day course for leadership, for C-suite folks, for VPs. It's an in-person class, and it will be run here in Houston, Texas, but it could be run for projects wherever. If a company or a project wants to host that course, they can do it, and it will be for the C-suite folks and all of the key stakeholder, the senior management level of the stakeholder organizations.
Yeah, I would just echo, basically getting the CSU team involved early is insurance. You know, it's not free, but it helps ensure that your project's going to be successful. Next comment, for early involvement in commissioning, what would you suggest for monitoring the productivity of the team?
It's not an easy as I don't know an easy answer to that question. I think obviously there's a certain degree of trust in there. So the CSU manager has to be able to monitor. He or she needs to be able to monitor the performance of the people working under his or her direction. I think another way of approaching this is that if the project is struggling in construction, but the CSU team appear to be super well prepared and with their arms folded, just waiting to get involved, then a key way to make their involvement more productive is to get them working alongside in that one team approach that Ed talked about, to really support the construction folks if they're in that position of struggle, so that it becomes clearly a unified one team approach. Because just like Ed said, you can't have, unless everybody makes it to the other side in the boat, you're all going to get wet. So I think it's about sharing the workload so that the project can be successful as a whole. I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think it partly does.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about Zenitor. One is, what capabilities does the Zenitor software offer? And then the next question is, what are the latest improvements in Zenitor?
Well, we've done quite a lot in adding mobile technology into Zenitor and streamlining workflows. So that's the biggest area. So we've got an app called Walk Down Capture, which deals with punch list management, and we have some other work that's in the works for all the other field-based activities, which will operate similarly with a similar workflow to the way that walk-down capture does. Zenator is an automation software product, and the sort of strap line for it, as we say, it's making the invisible visible. So it's all about bringing into one common single database all of the influences that will affect the outcome of the project, not just the check sheets. It will be all of the MOCs, the management of change items, all of the punch list items, all of the inhibits and isolations, every single thing that the commissioning manager is going to be responsible for during that project until final handover to operations, including things like all of the PSSRs as well.
Okay, the next item is a comment. The best time to integrate CSU is at feed stage. Maybe not all CSU team, but assistant completion coordinator who will interface with the feed team, provide a guard on how the work goes. It's a good comment. At this stage too, key project deliverables will be developed for review. Someone said they had to drop off. Next comment, manpower is doubled due to execution and development work, i.e. execution plans, integrated schedule, completion database development, declaration leads, matching A/B check sheets, systemization, etc. Just as engineering has discipline leads, CSU also has leads to facilitate coordination and review. So it's just another comment.
Yeah.
We got to thank you both gentlemen for sharing your experience with the attendees. Good luck. Another one, apologies, need to leave another call meeting. Will you be sharing the available CSU course for reference? So I think that's all the comments we had so far, Alan.
Okay, well, thanks, Ed, for the announcing all those questions, and thank you everybody who's been on this webinar for raising them. I really hope that you've enjoyed the experience. It brings us to the end, and I would just like to thank you, Ed, my good friend and colleague, for being such a good sport and taking part in today's discussion. And I hope you, the viewers from wherever you are in the world, have enjoyed being part of this process. And I look forward to receiving, I'll take time to read all of your comments later. There we are. So on Tuesday, the 8th of February, for 3 days, we have the in-person class, and it's going to be hosted here in the Houston metro area. And there'll be details posted in a link. This will be on LinkedIn. It will be in the video, and I'll be able to provide you the actual specific link where you can find more information on this course, and where you can sign up for it as well. If there were any questions on jargon, use of jargon, we'll try and answer those as well, so that we don't leave any acronym or jargon term unexplained. And I'll just say thank you everybody for joining us today, and from Ed and myself, stay safe and happy commissioning.
Thank you.